A lot of times we're trying to perform, right? We're trying to be what we think listeners will enjoy.
Yeah.
And I think people have a really good filter for what is real and what is fake, what is being acted. The best we can do for anything, probably in life, not just podcasting, is just be comfortable with who we are. And at least, hopefully, a good percentage of people will at least know that is real, that is authentic, and be able to connect with that. There's a few things. Firstly, what we really need to focus on before we even start recording is trying to really get a clear understanding of who our target audience is. What are the common themes among the most successful shows in our space that we want to make sure we integrate into our content? And then also, once we've studied our listener, we're going to find out as well where they're hanging out. So where are they finding new content right now? Are they finding it in LinkedIn? It might be email newsletters, or it might be Reddit forums. But then you mentioned that it's on YouTube. So I think SEO and search is really important. So making sure YouTube is, after all, the second biggest search engine. So how do we bake that into the content that we're creating to make sure that we're hitting on those themes and those keywords that we know are important to our target audience? But I think in terms of the content creation, consistency is so key. Finally, to talk about podcast promotion broadly, social media is really important for growth. We need to engage with our community. We need to continue to have the conversation about the podcast with our audience. So it's a great engagement tool.
Hi, this is Shubham Tiwari, and I welcome you to another episode of the Fireside Chats. Today we have with us somebody who's adept at making award-winning podcasts, from full narrative productions to self-hosted interview shows. He helps brands to find their podcast voice, from companies like HPE, PepsiCo to agencies, hypergrowth startups, and ambitious thought leaders. He has helped them all. I'm talking about none other than Harry Morton, the founder of Lower Street Media, who believes that podcasts help you in making meaningful human connections. Harry, welcome to the Thousand Faces Club.
Thank you so much for having me. What a generous introduction. Thank you.
I'm really interested in that, making meaningful human connection part. But before that, why do you listen to podcasts?
I listen to podcasts, firstly, because I'm just a massive audio nerd. I've been listening to radio and to podcasts for a long time. I'm deeply passionate about it. But I think sort of what I hope to get out of them, I guess what I'm looking for when I listen to a podcast these days is usually around education or kind of entertainment. So I'm either looking to just enjoy myself, find something entertaining, or I'm looking to learn something. It's my primary source of information these days. I don't tend to read as much. I don't tend to kind of watch as much video or things like that. I tend to just sort of consume things as I'm listening when going for a walk or in the car or all these kinds of things. So yeah, that's my.
So would it be fair to ask your top 3 podcasts of all time, or are you going to give us a current top 3?
All-time versus current 3. Well, my current 3 is probably not very interesting because I listen to a lot of business-related podcasts because that's what I'm excited by these days, which I imagine makes me extremely boring kind of company around the dinner table. But so my current sort of favorites would be things like My First Million, which you may have heard of. That's pretty big at the moment. I really love a podcast called Founders, which is all about sort of breaking down kind of historically really successful kind of entrepreneurs and people, which I've been really enjoying. And I listen to The Rest is Politics, which is a British show here, which I find really, really informative and interesting and entertaining. So that's a good one. In terms of all-time favorites, the first podcast I ever that really kind of got me into podcasting was the Ricky Gervais podcast, as it was for many other UK people. So that was a real pleasure. And then some of the kind of classic BBC things. I don't know if you've ever heard, there's a podcast called Around the World in 100 Objects, which is about, it's produced by the British Museum, and it's all about kind of various really interesting artifacts from around the world and the history behind them, which I found, really fascinating. But anyway, I could go on for ages. There's many, many podcasts, but there's a few highlights for you.
Right. So Harry, there are, 2 kinds of, schools of thoughts I can see where, one says that you have to sound perfect on podcasts. You have to be, you have to be at your best, nice production quality, of course, everything. And the other school of thought says that, you have to be natural. If you're laughing, you're talking over each other. I mean, where do you belong? Which school of thought you belong to?
Yeah, sure. Well, I suppose, for me, it's not black and white. I think there are merits to all sides of that equation. I think it also depends on the kind of show that you're making. If you're making a chat show that is about let's say it's a co-hosted show. For example, I gave My First Million as a podcast. That's one that I listen to. That is a show that it's all about business. And it's 2 co-hosts that are good friends with each other, and they talk about business and they kind of go back and forth. So that dynamic works wonderfully. You know, they laugh, they joke, they trade kind of insults with each other. They'll
Yeah.
also talk over each other from time to time. It's a very natural and kind of organic conversation that they try to have, and that's something that's really appealing as a listener, because it feels like you're sitting in the room there with them and you're part of that conversation, and that's a really kind of fun experience. But similarly, I mentioned Around the World in 100 Objects, which is very much more of a kind of documentary style, and really therefore your kind of delivery matters, and the way that you script and carefully craft the words that you're the messages you're trying to convey really matters. So I think it really depends upon the style of show you're trying to create, um, the kind of personality that you are. I think
Right.
you've mentioned in your notes the sort of importance of kind of being human and being authentic. And I think we can't. I'm certainly not a very well-spoken, concise person. I waffle, I meander, I and ah, and I'm terrible for editors to work with. So I apologize in advance to you and whoever's editing this podcast. It's a lot of work to work around sometimes. But I think it's important that we just kind of embrace who we are and speak and communicate in the way that is natural to us, and that's usually what ends up sounding best.
Yeah, yeah. And I would like to quote you. You said that, with the right podcast, you get to show people that you're human and that you have interesting things to say, right? So, I mean, two layers of complexity here. One kind of people who are struggling to find their voice, and another who are struggling to be consistent with their voice, right?
Mm.
So, what would you say to both?
Yeah, I think the answer is the same, and it comes back to the authenticity thing that I mentioned. I think quite often when we struggle to find a consistent voice, or we struggle to find what our voice is as we're trying to communicate in this particular medium, I think a lot of the time it's because we're trying to sound. This is what occurs to
Yeah,
me, and other people may feel differently. I'd love to hear what you think about it, but I think that a lot of times we're trying to perform, right? We're trying to be what we think listeners will enjoy.
yeah,
And I think people have a really good filter for what is real and what is kind of fake, what is being acted.
yeah,
And I think really the best we can do for anything probably in life, not just podcasting, is just be comfortable with who we are, own it, be it. I am definitely not the best communicator in the world, as I said, but and there's no getting away from that. So I just have to be who I am and waffle on and be the way,
right.
communicate the way that I communicate. It's the only thing I can do, and at least hopefully a good percentage of people will at least know that is real, that is authentic, and kind of be able to connect with that. So I think that's my main advice, is to just be who you are. If that doesn't sound too cliched and boring of a thing to say.
Yep, yep, absolutely correct. So, please tell us about Lower Street Media and what things are you doing there? Something new, something old, whatever you want to share.
Oh, sure. So Lower Street is a branded podcast agency. We work with brands. You mentioned a couple, to help develop the concepts for their podcasts, to obviously produce and write and create those together. And then we help them with kind of growing their audience and finding that listenership that they're looking for as well. So yeah, that's what we've been doing for 6 years now. We're a team of 20. We're fully remote. So I'm obviously here in the UK, as you can probably tell from the accent, but we have team members in America, in Canada, in Europe, in Asia as well. So we're spread out across the globe in working on this. And we're really focused, I suppose, on helping brands to do what I've just described, I suppose, is to try to communicate in a human, in an authentic way. Because I think that as brands, quite often, you've asked me about creators helping to find their voice. How do you find your voice? And I think brands can really struggle with that, because they have this extra layer of wanting
Yeah,
to make sure they're perceived in the right way. And so our job, I suppose, is to help them be perceived in the right way, but also, and usually being perceived in the right way is by being human, is by being kind of a bit vulnerable. And so that's what we're really interested in doing, and helping
right,
them to
right.
tell kind of, really interesting stories. I think, again, brands can sometimes fall into the trap of telling boring stories, because what's important to their business is, they want sales, they want leads, they want ROI. And so they focus on, the topics that
Yeah,
would lead to those things. And our job is
yeah,
to take those topics and find, okay, what's the story underneath these to make that actually a compelling, interesting listen, so that someone's actually going to be willing to spend their time with it, rather than
correct.
listening to a big infomercial. So yeah, that's what
Yeah.
we try to do.
One of the things, Harry, I would like to, I would like you to share with us is that, the growth playbook. because earlier in my career, when I was trying to grow a B2B podcast, I really struggled with that,
Mm,
because I mean, there were points where the thing was not going anywhere. So I mean, one of the things that lower street media does really well is the growth of podcasts, right?
yeah.
So how do you do that?
Sure. Well, I'd love to ask you what did you try? What were you frustrated by? What were the things that you tried, and maybe which ones worked and which ones didn't for you?
We tried to create a video podcast, a video for a B2B SaaS tool, and we really struggled with the distribution. I mean,
Mm,
LinkedIn was one of the source, and we tried group posting and other things, but really struggled with growing the number of listeners, the number of downloads. It didn't really go anywhere, to be honest.
mm.
So we did around
So
25
it was
episodes.
primarily, so your audiences were primarily therefore on YouTube, and LinkedIn is where you were trying to drive that listenership. Is that right?
I mean, in that case, it was LinkedIn, but
Yep.
nowadays we are trying to build this podcast for YouTube. So, I mean, if you can give us both examples, B2B and B2C, for growth.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah. Well, interesting. I think that uh, and sorry, final question for you, and I promise I'm going to answer the question,
Sure.
but I'd just love to know more about your particular experience. Were you targeting a global audience, an Indian audience, an American audience? Like, where was your sort of, what were you looking, where were you hoping to find listeners, or maybe it didn't matter? I'd love to know.
Uh, Primarily West-based audience for both B2B and
Okay.
B2C. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Um, well, I'm glad that's the answer, because that's the market I know most about. So that's helpful.
Okay.
Yeah, I think I think that there's a few things. Firstly, what we really might need to focus on before we even start recording is trying to really get a clear understanding of who our target audience is. And what we like to do when we're creating shows at Lower Street is to build up a really clear picture of what we see as the competitive landscape. So if we decide that we want to make a podcast about, I don't know, dentistry, we want to understand what is the landscape of dentistry related podcasts in North America, in our case. So what does that look like? What does the audience that we're seeking to serve, what other content do they have available to them, and what can we learn from that? So first of all, what are the common themes among the most successful shows in our space that we want to make sure we integrate into our content? Because I think, the first answer to your question is really making sure that we nail the content itself. Because
Right.
if we don't have something that we know that the market wants, we're not going to be able to grow it no matter how much money we throw at sort of promotion. So I think that's really important to start with. So if we really clearly understand who our listener is, and what value they need and what they're getting elsewhere, then we can make sure that we provide a podcast that is providing the value that they need and also is differentiated from the rest of the competition. So we're providing something new and a value. So that's a really, really important phase, I think. And then also, once we've studied our listener, we're going to find out as well where they're hanging out. So where are they finding new content right now? Are they finding it in, back to LinkedIn? It might be groups on LinkedIn, or it might be email newsletters, or it might be Reddit forums. Who knows? Like, there's a
Right.
bunch of different ways that people could be coming in to find our content. And I think identifying those is really key. But then you mentioned that it's on YouTube. So I think SEO and search is really important. So making sure, YouTube is, after all, the second biggest search engine. So how do we bake that into the content that we're creating to make sure that we're hitting on those themes and those keywords that we know are important to our target audience? Yes, I'm going to get carried away and talk about details and details and details. So
Please,
I'm not
please
quite
go
sure
ahead.
which way to go with this. But I think in terms of the content creation, consistency is so key. I'm sure that's something that you did, but it's an important ingredient that we'd be remiss for not mentioning.
Right.
And I think that finally, to talk about podcast promotion broadly, and I think this
Yeah.
applies probably more so to audio than video, but both certainly, is that social media is really, really important for growth. We need to engage with our community. We need to continue to have the conversation about the podcast with our audience. So it's a great engagement tool, but it's not necessarily a place that we're going to garner a lot of new listeners. It's hard for us to take people out of their social media mode, where they might be, I don't know, scrolling through their LinkedIn feed and they're looking for quick things to kind of read or like or share. They're not necessarily in that mode where they've got 30 to 40 minutes or an hour to sit down and listen to a podcast. So it's a great place to engage with our community, as I said, but it's not necessarily where we're going to find new listeners right now to listen to our show. So instead, we want to focus on identifying the places where our podcast listeners are already in podcast listening mode. So how can we get out on other podcasts that are relevant to our audience? How can we advertise on platforms that are podcast native, so that people aren't context switching? They're not moving from email or LinkedIn or Twitter to a podcast. They are already in podcast mode, and that means they're going to be much more open to listening to a long form piece of content. So a lot of the campaigns that we run to promote podcasts are really focusing on finding those listeners in that moment.
Right. So what are your views on pushing your podcast as ads, like promoting it, right? Paid ads, sorry. So is that the growth one should rely on in case they're not getting organic traction? Should it be a long term plan? How does it fit in the plan, like paid promotions?
Yeah, I think we should only think about working with paid promotions once we already have a baseline of traction, right? Like, if we talked about the content and getting that right, if we have the validation of a few hundred listeners or a few thousand listeners where we know, okay, people are listening to this, we're getting feedback, we know that they like it, we can look at our Apple and Spotify dashboards and see, okay, not only are we getting those listens, but we're actually sustaining their listenership. People are consuming the episode. So for anyone listening that's a bit technical, Apple will share with us our average consumption rate of our podcast, which means how much of each episode is the average listener consuming. And if we see that number is 10, 20, 30%, that means for the majority of listeners, they're listening to a few minutes and then just moving on. They're not listening anymore. And that's a bad sign, because that's showing us that clearly our content is either finding the wrong audience or it's just not right. And we need to change that first. Whereas if we see 70, 80, 90% completion rates of our content, and that's a really positive sign that, hey, we're getting something right here. We're clearly giving our listeners what it is that they're looking for. And then we're in a really great position to go, okay, now it's probably worth us investing in some proactive growth here.
Right.
So I think that, whether it's a paid social media campaign, whether it's a paid there are many podcast apps that allow you to buy ads, banner ads within those apps. So Castbox or Stitcher or, many of these Pocket Casts, many of these places will allow you to buy baked in ads in those places. And we found those to be quite successful in the past. So whatever paid platform you go down, I think it's really important that we don't rely on that as a crutch. If we're creating content and it's not working, then the answer isn't probably more paid promotions. It's probably thinking about, okay, what's wrong with our content? How can we tweak that and really perfect that for our audience to make sure that we've got the right thing to start with?
Right. And which is harder to grow, a video podcast or an audio only podcast?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, at Lower Street, we're really focused on audio. We do a bit of video, but it's very much the kind of secondary thing in our world. So I can't say that I can speak to video with a great deal of authority, but I can't see that there's an awful lot of difference in many ways. I think in YouTube, what we see is a slightly more viral platform. It's got more of that SEO kind of discovery baked into it, but there is also a huge amount more competition. And I think in audio, what we've got is a platform that is much less viral. It really, podcast listenership is driven mostly still by word of mouth. So people telling their friends, hey, you should go check out this podcast. Yeah. That means that's much less viral. It's very hard to grow, and it's slower to grow, but the listeners you get of an audio podcast tend to be much, much stickier. They tend to be much more loyal as listeners and audience members. So yeah, that's more of a comparison than an answer. I'm not sure I have a definitive answer for you there, but I think they both come with their challenges and their benefits.
Yeah. And one of the things you specialize in is the podcast strategy and developing the perfect show to meet business goals. So what is your playbook on defining KRAs? Because I ask this because majority of businesses struggle to find out the real ROI. At some point in time, they run out of patience. They don't even go to, let's say, 50 episodes. Even before that, they pull the plug. So how do you make sure that this thing, gets the time it needs? And what are the KRAs and ROI?
Yeah, ROI is a really interesting one in podcasting because, as I said, audiences tend to be slow to grow. And it's not like any other digital marketing medium where we might kind of have a very clear If we run a
Impact.
Google Ads campaign, for example, we can very clearly track what's our conversion rate, what's our cost per click, what's all of these metrics are things that we're very used to as digital marketers measuring. And sadly, or not sadly, depends on your kind of view of things. That is not the case in podcasting. It's much more akin to a TV campaign, for example, where you might kind of know the number of impressions you've had, but it's very hard to tie the listener of that podcast with a purchase or an action that you want them to take. So really, for the majority of our clients that we work with, what they're looking for is much sort of softer metrics in terms of they're looking to develop thought leadership. They're looking to really it's more of a brand play, right? And so what they care about less so is the conversion, but more so around, do our listeners feel better about our brand after having listened to our show? If the answer is yes, then that's a win. So in how we measure that, we can do that with brand lift studies and kind of surveys and just other ways of just surveying our audience to understand, how does this piece of content kind of change your perception or reinforce your perception of a brand. But in terms of, it's very much a case by case basis on how long you should run a podcast before you have a sense of what ROI, whether this show is performing or not. Because so much of it is informed by what are the goals. Who is our target audience? So to give you sort of an extreme example, we might have a brand whose target audience is C-suite execs within a particular vertical within a particular country. So their addressable market might be literally hundreds of people or less. So for them, success might be 50 listeners. They might, if they know that those 50 listeners are the people that they're trying to reach, which are high value individuals, that's a huge win. On the other end of the market, we might have someone that sells a $1 widget and it's a B2C audience and really all they care about is volume. There's a very different equation. And so how you go about measuring those and optimizing for those is completely different. So there's really, I guess there's no one answer.
There's no one answer, but I think there is one answer for who's an ideal podcaster. Is there an ideal podcaster? And if there is one, can you give us, let's say top 3 traits of an ideal podcaster?
Okay. So do you mean as an individual, as a host, as the sort of person to present a podcast? I think there is not one individual perfect person because every podcast listener has a different preference. There are so many niches and different kinds of content and audience members that we could be trying to attract. And I think everyone is attracted to a different style. Some people might be attracted to kind of that co-hosted format that I mentioned, where there's kind of more banter and friendly kind of relationship. Others might be drawn to more kind of very factual or scientific even, and therefore the sort of content they're looking for is a very different style. So I think really the traits that it comes back to again is what I said before, is that authenticity, that vulnerability, that ability to be human and be yourself, I think is the perfect podcast host. Obviously, someone that is terrible at writing scripts or just, they might be terrified of public speaking, even though the beauty of podcasting, by the way, if you are terrified of public speaking, as I am, is you get to hide behind a microphone where no one can see you. You do it in the dark of your bedroom and pretend that no one's listening and then share it later. But, people have different personalities and things that suit them. And so, being a podcaster isn't for everyone. But I think for anyone that's interested in speaking and talking, then really everyone is suitable for this medium. And I think the way that you succeed is just by truly trying to be yourself.
Amazing. So there's this fun segment that we do where you have to give us your first impression of, the word that I'm going to tell you. So First word is podcast intros.
They're a pitch, aren't they? They're a way to hook your listener and get them to listen to the rest of your show.
Background music.
Background music is setting a scene. It's emotion. It's about kind of making sure that your audience is feeling the right way as they listen to your content. I think it's a wonderful emotive thing.
Fumbles,
they're human, aren't they? That's great. That's, we shouldn't necessarily worry about those too much, I don't think.
Talking over each other.
Again, same. We're human, mistakes happen. That's what editors are for if it's necessary. And it's the beauty of podcasting. If we make a mistake, if we talk over each other, we get to go again and say, let's edit that out. So yeah, I think that's nothing to worry about.
Harry Morton.
Harry Morton, fumbling, skinny British person.
Low Street Media.
Lower Street Media is I could only give you the pitch. It's a branded podcast agency that does terrific work.
Wonderful. We all can see that. And last two rituals we make our guests go through. Any source that you want to refer to our audience? Any books, any podcasts, any blogs, anything on podcasting?
On podcasting, I would, if anyone is interested in the podcast industry and wants to really educate themselves on this space, I would highly recommend checking out a couple of resources. The first one is podnews.net, is a wonderful source of all industry news in this space, and anyone that's passionate about podcasting should sign up to that. Another one is soundsprofitable.com, which is kind of more on the monetization side of things. So any kind of aspiring creator that wants to create a great podcast and hopefully monetize that in the future, then I think those are two wonderful resources that everyone should check out.
It's wonderful. Definitely. We'll try to find those and put their links in the description. Last one. Would you like to nominate anyone for our show?
On the top of my head, I don't know, but I'm sure I'll be able to think of something. If I can come back to you on that, I hate to sort of not have an answer for the show here, but maybe I can come back to you later. Is that okay?
That's absolutely fine, Harry. Thank you so much for coming on the show and giving us the insights and sharing your thoughts on many questions. I hope our listeners, they take whatever nuggets of wisdom they see useful. Any last words that you want to share with our audience?
No, just thank you so much for having me. What a pleasure this has been. A real joy. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And if you enjoyed listening to this, please let us know in the comment box, and we'll see you in the next episode. Thank you so much. And cut. That's it for today's episode, guys. If you really liked it, please subscribe to the 1000 Faces Club and press the bell icon below so that you don't miss any videos from us. Thank you.